Hi everybody, this week we are talking about general endocrine disorders. These are conditions that affect the endocrine system, and next week we're going to talk about a special endocrine disorder, which is diabetes mellitus. But this week we're going to talk about a variety of conditions that affect endocrine function. And before we jump into different conditions, what we're going to talk about first is we're going to remind ourselves what the basic way that the endocrine system works. And then also we're going to talk about different sources of endocrine dysfunction and how they can manifest. Okay, so what we have here is a reminder of what endocrine function, what the components of endocrine function really are. So we start off with some kind of endocrine gland, okay? And if you recall, endocrine glands are glands that will secrete chemical messengers in the form of hormones directly into the bloodstream. So the first step here is the release of hormone into the bloodstream. So this pink box here is your circulatory system. And once a hormone is released into the bloodstream, it can either travel through the bloodstream free and biologically active, okay? And water-soluble hormones generally will be able to do that. We'll be able to travel free and biologically active in plasma. But some hormones will be found bound to plasma proteins. Now, hormones that are fat-soluble will always need to be bound to plasma proteins. And the most common plasma protein for these fat-soluble hormones to be bound to is albumin. Now, some hormones, both that are water-soluble and fat-soluble, will also have specific hormone-binding proteins. These are proteins in the plasma whose sole job it is to bind to a particular hormone and carry it around the bloodstream. Now, specific binding proteins tend to have a much higher affinity for the hormone than albumin generally does for the hormone. With albumin, hormones usually have a fairly low affinity for albumin, or albumin has generally a low affinity for circulating hormones, and so the hormone spends a lot of time unbound to albumin and bound to albumin. That it's only when the hormone is unbound to any protein, including albumin, that it is free to actually act on target cells. So hormones that do bind to specific binding proteins, what this does is actually it's a way for the hormone to basically be stored in circulation and have sort of a very stable concentration in circulation, but the hormone, only a percentage of the hormone at any given time is actually free to act on target cells, okay? While much of the hormone that's in circulation is actually bound to those specific binding proteins. So the hormone, as I said, is going to exist either free or biologically active or bound to plasma proteins. Now, when the hormone is in its free and biologically active state, it's able to act on target cells. But also, when the hormone is free and biologically active, it also can undergo metabolism in the liver or other tissue. Now, metabolism can really accomplish two things. Metabolism can either inactivate that hormone, and more commonly it will inactivate the hormone, and it's a step to the hormone's excretion. But sometimes liver metabolism will actually activate the hormone. It will take an inactive hormone and convert it to an active hormone. Okay. So only when the hormone is free and biologically active can it leave the bloodstream and either get metabolized or act on target cells. Now, when a hormone acts on a target cell, last semester we talked about normal hormone function. When a hormone attaches to a target cell, it's going to act at a receptor. Now, hormone receptors can either be found on the plasma membrane or inside the cell in the DNA, and actually inside the cell in the nucleus, and the receptor is actually sitting at the promoter region of a gene within the DNA. So if you recall from last semester, we talked about how water-soluble hormones must bind to receptors on the surface of the plasma membrane, while fat-soluble hormones, like steroid hormones or thyroid hormone, can actually diffuse across the membrane and bind to receptors that are found in the nucleus on the promoter region of genes along the DNA. And those fat-soluble hormones tend to regulate gene expression by the cell. So either way, wherever that receptor is, the hormone's going to bind to that receptor. Some of those receptors, especially the ones that are on the plasma membrane, are going to act through some kind of second messenger system. But ultimately, that hormone is going to have some kind of physiologic effect on the cell. Okay? It's going to have some kind of physiologic effect on the cell. And then that physiologic response, so that physiologic effect, is going to provide negative feedback regulation at the level of the endocrine gland, and it will tend to reduce the amount of hormone that's released. Okay, so this is the general pattern of action of our endocrine system. So what we see here in this slide also are these red arrows, and whenever you see a red arrow, it represents a target for possible endocrine dysfunction. So here the first arrow is at endocrine release of hormone. So this is like probably the easiest or most simple form of an endocrine disorder, where the endocrine gland either produces too little of the hormone or too much of the hormone. And the general effect is that you get less of this physiologic response. And when you get less of the particular physiologic response, we call that a hyposecretory effect, right? So if it's thyroid hormone, then you have hypothyroidism, right? If it's any other hormone with less secretion, we're talking about a hyposecretory problem. We can also have hypersecretion. That endocrine gland can put out too much hormone, and you get too much of the physiologic response. And you get that, in that case, we call it a hypersecretory problem. Okay? So the first place is pretty simple. It's just about too much hormone secretion. The other arrow here is at the liver metabolism, or at the tissue metabolism. So too much metabolism means that the hormone is getting eliminated from the blood too quickly. Too little metabolism, right? Let's say you have liver failure, right? That's going to potentially increase the half-life of the hormone. Okay? And so if we have too little hormone metabolism and elimination, the result is a hyposecretory effect, right? You get too much of the physiologic response. If you have metabolism that is too rapid, it's a hyposecretory effect. Okay? Excuse me, a hypersecretory effect. We're not eliminating the hormone too quickly enough. Okay? And then we have the next arrow is receptor problems. So when we have receptor problems, that is one kind of target cell oriented problems, right? Where the problem is not in terms of how much hormone is being released or how much hormone is circulating. It's really about cell responsiveness. So cell responsiveness can be a receptor problem. If we have too few receptors, then it has the effect of a hyposecretory problem. If we have too many receptors, it could be a hypersecretory problem. Okay? But the problem is not necessarily in the amount of hormone that's circulating, but in the number or quality of the receptors. Similar to a receptor problem, we may have plenty of receptors, but we don't have enough of the second messenger. Okay, so maybe there's an enzyme that's deficient within the cell that interrupts that signaling cascade, and you don't get enough of that second messenger. And so again, the cell will not respond. You won't get the physiologic response, and the cell will not respond. Okay. And then the last example of a problem is in negative feedback. So it could be that every single one of these steps is perfectly fine, right? You're getting the physiologic response, but maybe the problem is actually in the endocrine gland's ability to receive negative feedback. Okay. So if that's the case, then you're going to have unregulated hormone production, and that unregulated hormone production will probably look like a hypersecretory effect, but it could be a hyposecretory effect. So the last possibility is that it's actually a hormone feedback regulation problem. Okay. So we're going to see lots of examples of this as we go through this entire unit, examples of problems of endocrine secretion, endocrine gland secretion, problems of excretion, problems of target cell responsiveness, problems that affect feedback regulation. So we're going to talk about a lot of hormone systems and diseases of hormone systems, but we did learn last semester that one gigantic category of hormones come from this hypothalamic pituitary axis, right? Where the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work together to control the release of a multitude of hormones in the body. Right, so the majority of hormones and hormone systems and endocrine glands in the body are actually controlled by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So just to remind ourselves, our hypothalamus contains these neurosecretory cells, and those neurosecretory cells project to the pituitary gland. Now there are two zones of the pituitary gland. We have the posterior pituitary, and hopefully we remember that the hypothalamus, that the posterior pituitary is really an extension of the hypothalamus, that those neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, the cell bodies are in the hypothalamus, and they send their axon fibers through the connecting stalk, and those axon terminals are sitting in the posterior pituitary. So we have hypothalamic hormone released at the posterior pituitary. And two hormones are released this way, right? We had antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, and we had oxytocin released like this as well. The hypothalamus is also releases hormone onto the anterior pituitary. Now the anterior pituitary is a truly separate endocrine structure from the hypothalamus. It contains endocrine cells that release a variety of anterior pituitary hormones. Those hormones are triggered to get released by hypothalamic hormones, or inhibited to be released by other hypothalamic hormones. And those anterior pituitary hormones get released into the bloodstream, and they act usually on some peripheral gland, a gland outside the central nervous system, and regulate the release of a third hormone. So here is that connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So we have those neurosecretory cells. They originate in the hypothalamus at the paraventricular nucleus and also at the supraoptic nucleus. Those cells send their axons down through the connecting stalk, and their axon terminals are sitting within the posterior pituitary, right opposed to small networks of capillaries. And so these two hypothalamic hormones, vasopressin, which is also antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, get released from the hypothalamus at the posterior pituitary, and that's where they enter those capillaries and go on to systemic circulation. Now, vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone we learned about last semester. It regulates two major things. It regulates water balance, so it controls how much water is reabsorbed without sodium at the kidneys. And by doing that, it controls blood osmolarity. ADH, or vasopressin, is also a vasoconstrictor, so it tends to elevate blood pressure. Now, oxytocin is the other hormone. Oxytocin is also released at the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is primarily known as the hormone that is very important for breastfeeding. So oxytocin does not stimulate the mammary glands to make breast milk, but what it does is stimulate smooth muscle within the mammary glands to eject milk from the breast. So oxytocin controls something called milk letdown, or the release of breast milk from the mammary glands. And here is just another image illustrating this. So we have the first image is our hypothalamic neurosecretory cells in the PVN and the SON that go down through this connecting stalk, and their axon terminals release ADH and vasopressin, ADH, and oxytocin at the posterior pituitary. And then here we see our neurosecretory cells, other neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus that project not down through the connecting stalk, but rather just project into an area called the median eminence, which is a small capillary network is found there. So that hypothalamic hormone is released into that capillary network right there. And that hypothalamic hormone, or the hypothalamic hormones, I should say, are carried through this short circulatory route, this set of capillaries, that then carries those hormones into the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary is packed with these endocrine cells. There's actually 5 distinct endocrine cells that release a variety of anterior pituitary hormones that go off and control the release of more hormones in the periphery. And we're going to review every single one of those.